everybody. I'm Orrin Phillips, and I am so very pleased today. This is a guest we've been trying to get for a long time. I got to meet him at Terrificon, and he was such a nice person. I'm talking about Mr. Ralph Macchio. Ralph is known throughout the industry as one of the best editors of all time, from Spider-Man, Daredevil, so many other books he's worked on, either as a writer and an editor. He is Marvel royalty. And we're so glad to have him today. You're going to hear some wonderful stories. So without further ado, here's Ralph, a comic book legend. I'm talking about Mr. Ralph Macchio. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Let's start at the very beginning. How do you first discover comics?
I first discovered comics when I went to camp. I remember it was Rockley Day Camp. And I remember the kids up there. I must have been about 8 years old. My parents sent me. It was a day camp. It wasn't a stay away camp. But I remember around lunchtime that the kids were taking out comic books from their cubby holes, and they were reading them over lunch, and they were exchanging them. And I had, I watched the Superman television show and all that. And this, of course, was for me. This was in the late '50s, so there were no Marvel comics back then.
Right.
These were the Julie Schwartz and the Mort Weisinger, Superman comics, Justice League, all that. Mm. And I began to look at them, and I saw the way they were trading them and all that. And I said, this is a lot of fun. So I went down to my local stationery store at that time. You got everything on the spinner rack, and I started to buy comics. But as I said, it was years before Marvel came out. I was just a kid, but the Mort Weisinger Superman books were perfect for kids between 8 and 10. And Julie Schwartz, Justice League, Flash, Green Lantern, the Atom, all that. I became huge fans. Batman, Aquaman, and that's how I really started. That was my initial first introduction to the world of comic books.
So how is the decision made later on in life that this might be a career you want to pursue?
It's interesting. When people have asked me, I had to say I never really thought about entering comics because as a career, because this was around, I started Marvel in 1976, and in the early to mid 70s, I was in college. I was in graduate school. I was doing my graduate work in English Lit at Montclair State, and I was preparing to become an English teacher. I didn't know what you did if you were in comics, if you weren't really writing them. And I didn't see myself as a writer. I didn't know anything about being on staff, that you had a career as an editor on staff or anything. So that never hit me. And then my origin story is, I was at one convention in 1975. This was in New York, and I'd gone to it because I heard that Jack Kirby was going to be there. And of course, by then I was a huge fan of Kirby and Stan and all the Marvel books. And as I was leaving the convention, and I was just at the door, this was in the lobby area. I think this was at the Statler Hilton. This was back when comic conventions, you had 300 or 400 people. You had the guys behind the desk with the boxes of comics. That was, kind of it. Although they back then you still had some celebrities. And I did get an autograph from Mr. Kirby. And I heard somebody mention the Black Panther. And as I was just about to leave the convention, I turned to my left, and there was a guy out in the lobby area, and he was behind a table, and it looked like he was signing Black Panther comics. So I went over to him, and I mentioned my name and all that. And he goes, "Hey, man, you sent all those letters into the Black Panther and to kill Raven." And it was Don McGregor, who was writing both books at that time. So he was, and I had sent a lot of letters because I was a big fan of both those books and his writing. And he invited me to stay. He said, hang around. He goes, I'll take you back into the convention, meet some professionals and all that. And I was, okay. But had I just pushed through the door then, I probably would not be here talking to you because I had no intention of going into comics as a business. And he took me upstairs back into the convention. And then he said, how would you like to get a tour of Marvel? He goes, because I'm heading back to Marvel. So I said, okay. And I'm just hanging out in the city and all that. So he took me up to Marvel. Chris Claremont was up there, who was writing the X-Men and Iron Fist at that time. It was kind of just starting out. I sent a lot of letters to him too. And he goes, hey, I recognize your name from the letter column. He goes, I'm editing Marvel's Foom magazine, which was our fan magazine back then. He said, would you like to do an article? He goes, I know you obviously know how to write from the letters. And I said, okay, I'm not really really doing anything? Sure. So he says, I want you to interview Roy Thomas, and I want you to write an article about Conan. So I said, okay. So I found out that Roy was deciding whether or not to go to Hollywood or to come back as editor in chief at the time. And so I would come in on Fridays when he was in at Marvel, but he was too busy for the interview. So every time I would talk to him, he'd go, hey, come back next week. I'll talk to you then. And that gave me an excuse to hang around Marvel. And I began to see that there were careers at Marvel, with people in the bullpen doing production work. There were editors up there who were editing comics and such. And I thought, this could be interesting because the career as a teacher wasn't really going anywhere. It was a very bad time to try to get a job as a teacher. Mm-hmm. So I wound up hanging around Marvel, getting to know people. And eventually I did interview Roy for Food Magazine, and I did write the article on Conan. And then I got very friendly with John Warner, who was the assistant on the Marvel Black and White magazine line, which was Planet of the Apes, Deadly Hands of Kung Fu, Marvel Preview, bunch of books like that, Doc Savage. Archie Goodwin then got promoted to editor-in-chief. John became the editor of the Black and White line, and he said, Ralph, he goes, if you're not doing anything, he goes, you want to become my assistant? So I said, yeah, I'm not doing anything. It was all, I have to say, or it was very casual. It was not anything that I had planned. There was no master plan to get into Marvel. And I got hired in April of 1976 as John's assistant, and I never left. Wow. So that's how that worked out. And excuse me, I got the sniffles. And it worked out. I stayed there for 35 years, full-time on staff. And I have to tell you this, at the time that I started, what I was saying was in 1976, even if you had a job on staff, the editors who were on staff, and they really were not full editors. You had an editor-in-chief, an associate editor, and then you had a bunch of guys who were kind of proofreading, looking the books over. You didn't really stay on staff as a career. You saw your career really as waiting until there were enough books open for you to take them as a writer and leave staff. That's how Gerber did it, Engelhardt did it, Jerry Conway, a whole bunch of other guys. I never saw it that way. When I got on staff, I really enjoyed working with people. And I said, I'd rather do this. I didn't like the solitary life of a writer. I really liked the idea of interacting with people and kind of handling the comics more as a director than actually a writer. And so I just stayed on staff while a lot of other people took their books and left. Don McGregor, Marv Wolfman, even though they became, Marv and Glenn, they became editor-in-chief, as did Jerry. It was still only you stayed long enough until you got enough books, and then you kind of left. Len Wein, if I remember correctly, he actually got lured away from Marvel when he was editor-in-chief because he was offered the Batman books to write at DC. So he left. So I just never saw it that way. I just loved I like going into work. I lived in New Jersey. I was within commuting distance, and it was just a great thing to do every day. And I said I stayed on staff for 35 years, and even after I left, I've kept my connections with Marvel. I still do consulting editing. I still hang out at the office every once in a while, and I write a lot of introductions to the Masterworks, to the Epic editions, omnibuses, etc. And I still write the occasional comic too. So that's my career in a nutshell.
I just want to touch general strokes about certain things. We'll talk a little more specifically about books you worked on. But as a writer, when you're writing a story, I know you've sort of done a lot of one-offs, but you also had some runs on books. When you have a run on a book, do you have a beginning and an end point solidified in your mind of where you want the story to go? Or did you keep it open to see maybe things change as you change as the story goes on?
That would really depend on the book. When I was given the opportunity by Roger Stern to write a couple of issues of Marvel 2-in-1, which was really one of the first things I did. I also had written before that, I wrote the Second Kiss book. Steve Gerber did the first one, and I was asked to write the second one, even though I was a novice at the time. And I worked with John Romita Jr., then, who was on staff doing corrections. Hard to believe, he's a superstar, but now back then he was just doing corrections on staff, working, with his father and all that. But when I got the opportunity, Roger Stern asked me, he goes, listen, Ralph, he goes, we're kind of going back and forth with Marvel 2-in-1. Over the weekend, he goes, come up with some ideas for 2-in-1, and I'll let you write a couple of issues. And I thought that was a very gracious thing. I had been very friendly with Roger. We became good friends. So over the weekend, this was again around 1979,
Mhm.
I was thinking Jimmy Carter was president, and people who were alive back then remember that we were in a major energy crisis.
Mhm.
Gas prices were through the roof. There was an energy shortage. Carter gave his speech that time with the cardigan sweater about how we have to conserve energy.
Mhm.
Gas lines were around the block. So I thought, rather than just write a couple of issues, I'll try to come up with something that would have some relevance and would actually be a place in the Marvel universe. And I thought about what Jack Kirby had done when he took over Jimmy Olsen and he created the DNA Project.
Mhm.
And I said, I want to do something like that. So what popped into my head was, let me do something related to energy research because that was on people's minds at that time with the energy shortage. So I came up with Project Pegasus,
Mhm.
which has been used extensively in the Captain Marvel movie and the Avengers, etc. And I came up with a two-part story. That was, I think, issues 53, I think, and 54. I
Mhm.
might be wrong on that. And once I was done with those, I went back to my, normal staff job, whatever. But then Mark Grunwald, who had been hired in 1978, he came to me and he said, Ralph, he goes, I like that so much. He goes, I came up with the idea for us to do a 6-part story with Project Pegasus. And he kind of had laid out the basic outline. So we approached Roger Stern about it. And Roger said, I really like this. He goes, I think I can get John Byrne to do it. And then after that, we had George Perez on it, and we did a 6-parter, and we followed it with one issue that had the Impossible Man. And then we stayed on 2-in-1. So there was no real end goal except to come back to 2-in-1 and then stay on it for as long as they would have us. And we completed the 2-in-1 Project Pegasus storyline, and then we went on from there to do a bunch of other things. But it was different on Thor, for example.
Mhm.
Mark and I were Roy Thomas's. This was around issues 296 and going upward. Roy was the writer, but he had asked Mark Grunwald and I to kind of be his East Coast liaisons. We would kind of feed him ideas every once in a while. He would give us the opportunity to write an alternate issue.
Mhm.
And then before 300, he left. And Mark came to me and he goes, Ralph, he goes, we have to write 300 because Roy is gone. And I said, we have to end the Ring of the Nibelung saga, the whole ring cycle, which he had not completed.
Mhm.
And we also have to end this huge storyline in there where we had the Celestials. We're trying to figure out how to end that with Odin and Asgard and this whole big thing. And so that became a major undertaking for us to do. And eventually we got it all done. And I'm very proud of what we did with 300 because that was kind of like a major thing in the history of the Thor comic. We got that done, and then Jim Salicrup asked us to stay on Thor for a while. I think it was either Jim or Roger Stern, one of the two of them, and we stayed on Thor for a bit. So there was no, again, real end game. It was more like completing a storyline
Right.
that you were doing. There was so much to do with Thor 300. It was a huge undertaking, and we kept adding pages to it to make it bigger and bigger.
Mhm.
So that's how that worked. I also had a kind of a stint on Avengers, but
Mhm.
again, I was only brought in to write a certain period, a certain number of issues. Doctor Strange, I did the same thing. Roger Stern asked me to come in. He plotted a few issues. I scripted them. I also had the opportunity to work on Solomon Kane. I did a 6-issue. Carl Potts was the editor back then, and he knew how much I liked the Howard characters. And I told him I particularly liked Solomon Kane. So he says, why don't you write, we're going to do a 6-issue Solomon Kane thing. So I said, that's great. I had the opportunity to write Solomon Kane. And also, I was so into the character that I asked him if instead of just doing adaptations, if I could come up with some original stories for Solomon Kane. And I did. And I had an opportunity to work with Brett Blevins on one of them. And Mike Mignola did one before he became Mike Mignola. And he did a brilliant job on it. So that was another thing. Again, there was no real end game in sight
Right.
for the entire series. Just working on it as long as as I could.
Could you have seen yourself doing like a 3, 4, like a Chris Claremont long run on a book where, you know, you put together a whole universe, or did you kind of like moving a little bit from book to book, dealing with different characters?
Yeah, I don't think, I never really saw myself honestly as a writer.
Hmm.
I had nothing but admiration Claremont and Frank Miller and Simonson and Marv and Len and all those guys, because they could work on a book for years and never seem to run out of ideas. And I never saw myself that way. I don't know how long I could actually last on a book before I'd start repeating myself. I don't think my real strength in comics was as a writer, although I did enjoy what I did.
Yeah.
And so, no, I never really saw myself staying on a book. I mean, if they had asked us to stay on Thor and I was working with a highly creative guy like Mark Grunwald, we might have been able to do it. And we did have a long stint on Marvel 2-in-1, but not the years and years that guys like Chris put in, 10, 15 years on a book, even longer.
Yeah.
I could never see myself doing it.
When they came to you with the opportunity to become an editor, did you feel you were prepared for the job?
Yes, when I started with John Warner working on the black and white magazines, I really learned a lot from John, from Archie Goodwin, who was the editor in chief at the time, one of the great professionals of all time. And I was an assistant for 7 years before I was asked to become an editor. And even when I became an editor, that was when Jim Shooter had become editor in chief after Archie left. I sort of became, I didn't take over any of the main Marvel titles. I wound up working on a lot of the toys at the time. US1, Micronauts, ROM. I was the toy office. I had the Dazzler, things like that. And I loved them. I loved working on them. I just got they sent me an omnibus, the hardcover of the third Micronauts, because I edited that series for quite some time. And I had a great time with Rom. Oh, and also Christar, which was something that I co-created with Mark Grunwald, Jim Shooter, and John Romita Jr. Because Jim had this idea that we should create a toy and then sell it to the toy company rather than them coming to us where we would license it from them. He goes, let's us come up with a toy. So he assigned me and Mark to come up with something. We came up with Christar, the Crystal Warrior, and Waltar was the bad guy. We tried to keep it simple like you did with Rom and Micronauts. You had the good guys and the bad guys. With Rom, you had the dire wraiths and you had the space knights and all good and bad. So we tried to keep it that way. So that was fun too. But again, I wound up editing all those. So one time I was really the toy office. So it wasn't until years after that I was given the opportunity to edit any mainstream Marvel books. And yes, I did feel I was prepared at that point.
I was going to jump to it a little while, but since you brought it up, Rom is a book that I always felt somebody could have phoned it in because it was a book based on a toy, but there was so much wonderful stuff going on in Rom.
It was. Gotta hand
I mean, the humanity of the character and how he changed and how the people around him changed. It was so wonderfully done.
Yes. Yeah. I tell you something. I wish I had been able to stay on Rom longer. I got called off it after a certain number of issues. However, the contributions that I made, in addition to working with a great guy like Bill Mantlo, who also I became friends with, and it just was a terrific guy. I wanted to get a little bit more depth in the artwork. Sal Buscema, one of the great pros of all time. But I wanted to get a little bit different look to his art. So I put these two guys on, Aiken and Garvey, and they really, great stuff with Sal's artwork. Also, another thing I was very proud of was Bill Mantlo came to me at one point and he said, Ralph, he goes, I know contractually we cannot show the dire wraiths. Now, I was not on ROM at the beginning, and I don't know what the story was. Jim Shooter, I guess, negotiated the contract with Hasbro or whoever it was that owned ROM. And for some reason, we couldn't show the dire wraiths. They wanted to keep them hidden. So the only time you could see them, they were kind of like these little fur balls or something that kind of looked mean, and they had these sort of teeth, but they weren't anything that really was terrifying or anything. So I went to Jim and I said, listen, Jim, I said, Bill Mantlo really would like to show the dire wraiths. I said, and you being a ROM fan, I'm sure you know, eventually we saw them. What happened was I went to Walt Simonson and I said, Walt, here's the story. I said, ROM, you're familiar with the characters and all. I said, would you design the dire wraiths for me? So Walt came in with some great designs. The ones with the long tongue, the whole thing with the alien and all. So we got them designed. And then Jim was able to work some wonders with the contract, and from that point on, we could show the dire race. Bill was a happy camper, and I was too, with the way the book was reading and looking, and now seeing the dire race. I only wish I'd been able to stay on the book to its conclusion. I think it went to Mike Carlin after that, and I think Sal left and Steve Ditko came on.
Yep.
If that was a book I really would like to have seen to its ending, but I didn't get the chance to. But I was proud of the contributions that I made to Rob. I'm glad that you like the book too.
Could you talk a little bit about Bill? Because this is a guy who seems like he was an idea factory. I mean, he was doing so many stories and
Yes.
so many books and had these wonderful, wonderful ideas. Unfortunately, I think it's a name that's gotten forgotten a little bit in time, but such a wonderful writer. And could you talk a little bit about your experience working with Bill?
Yes. I had the chance to work with Bill not only on Rom, but also on the Micronauts,
Mhm.
which was another incredibly creative thing that he did. Bill actually started on staff at Marvel as a staff colorist. That's something most people don't know. He was doing staff coloring, and I guess at that time the opportunity came up for Bill to do fill-ins on certain books. Every once in a while a writer would fall behind,
Mhm.
and the editor would be looking around for people to do fill-in issues. And I guess Bill sort of popped up, I guess, and said, "Hey, I can write too." So he was given the opportunity to do some single issues of some of the comics. They turned out very well, and eventually he was given the opportunity to work on a number of mainstream Marvel books, the Hulk and Iron Man, and a whole bunch of other things. And he was an all-around guy, and he was a very creative guy. I mean, the guy who co-created along with what's his name, Rocket Raccoon,
Yep.
um, and and, uh, and when it came to the Micronauts, and I wrote this in my introduction to the omnibus version. Bill had gotten those characters, those toys. I don't know if it was Mego again or Hasbro, whoever,
Mhm.
but he'd gotten them for his son for Christmas, and an idea popped into his head that this would make a great comic book. And he came in one day, and I met him in the hall, and we were talking, and he was just bursting with ideas for the Micronauts. But he had to convince Jim Shooter that we should try to get the license to make it into a comic. And he did. And the Micronauts ran for a good long time, I think 5 or 6 years. And then after he left, I wound up working with Bill on the last bunch of issues. I hadn't worked with him on it from the beginning, but I did work with him for a while on it. And then he left, and I had Peter Gillis on it. But we were building still on with the new Micronauts. We were building on what Bill had done, and it was just fantastic because he had laid the groundwork for everything that we did in that series, and it was just phenomenal. But yes, he was an idea factory. Any book he took over, there were always new characters,
Mhm.
popping up everywhere, and it was just he was a nice guy. Towards the end of his career at Marvel,
Mhm.
he was going to law school at the same time. And I wondered, I said, Bill, how can you juggle writing assignments while you're going to law school too? And he says, Ralph, he goes, I love what I'm doing so much that it's just a pleasure. He goes, the comics are kind of a pleasure to do while I'm reading these heavy law books. And I believe he became a lawyer too. He used to come up to Marvel with his son Adam sitting on his shoulders, and they would walk around and they hang out in different offices and everything. But he lived in the Upper West Side. He became good friends with Mark Broomall too, and he really was a terrific, terrific guy to work with. I just love the guy.
That's awesome. As someone who is editing licensed properties, I hear certain things. Some people say that there could be a lot of cooks in the kitchen. Sometimes the licensees want certain things. They want to push a certain character. They want things to be a certain way. Other times you hear they're pretty hands off, like, here you go, do what you want to do as long as, it gets out there. What was the majority of your experience like dealing with licensed properties?
I think it was kind of in between what you were
Okay.
saying. I do remember working with Ron Wilson on He-Man.
Hmm.
That was another one of the licensed projects that I worked on.
Hmm.
And they were on us continually, to the point where we had to have the editor-in-chief call them up and say, listen, will you give these guys a break, because we're never going to get a book out. Every single panel, they wanted something changed. They wanted the costume changed. They wanted the angle we were seeing the characters from change. Poor Ron Wilson, he had to go back to the drawing board a million times to do the same page. And he did it great the first time, but they were just on us constantly. On the other hand, with ROM and Micronauts, they were pretty much hands-off. They wanted to see what we were doing, but as long as we were faithful to the characters and to that world that they had created, they pretty much left us alone. So as I said, it kind of ran from one to the other, but generally it was right down the middle. You knew they were looking over your shoulder, and they did have to approve things. I had that also on when I worked on the Stephen King books, when we did The Stand and we did The Dark Tower. Before any of those issues could go out, the initial issues went to Stephen King himself to look at. And of course, he was fabulous to work with. But then they went to his major assistant, his right-hand man, Chuck Verrill, and he had to approve the issues before they went out. But Chuck was a guy who would have made a great editor, because he would read the issues that we would send him of The Dark Tower and The Stand, and he would come back and he'd find places that I missed, where balloons were going to the wrong people and there were misspellings. And I said, Chuck, I wish you were on staff, because you caught stuff that we missed. So he was great to work with. So that was another kind of a licensed sort of a thing. But even though they, Stephen King looking over your shoulder is something, and having Chuck Verrill there, that was also something too. But again, never anything that really held us up. It was just always nudging us in the right direction. It was great.
And this question, it goes to Dark Tower too, but in general, when you're putting a team together for a book, what are some things you're looking for from an artist, from a writer, to see if they would bond together, if they would work together well?
It's interesting because, again, that varies from book to book. Some of the books that I would take over, the team was already on it. On other books, I would bring the team together. And it was, I remember, for example, on a book that I wasn't going to edit. If you remember, there was Heroes Reborn, where a lot of the Marvel books went off to the Image guys. But then when they came back to Marvel, we needed to get writers and artists on them. And Bob Harris had assigned me the task of getting some writers and artists on those books, even though I wasn't going to be editing them. One in particular was the Avengers. And I remember at the time, I had been talking to George Perez, and George was saying that he began to realize at that point in his career that he would be primarily known as a penciler. He could pencil, he could ink, he could even write, George. But he goes, I think, and I said, George, I said, listen, the Avengers is coming open. I said, you already had a stint on the Avengers. I said, the problem is that because your work is so detailed, you wound up doing 3 or 4 issues, but then you had to get 2 or 3 issues done by someone else because you just couldn't meet those deadlines. And he said, he goes, Ralph, I've realized that. I said, listen, George, if you can come on the Avengers and guarantee you'll do a year's worth without a fill-in, I said, I'm sure I can convince Bob you're the guy. And then I talked to Kurt Busiek. And Kurt is, again, a highly talented guy. Did make many contributions to Marvel. And I said, Kurt, I said, listen, we were talking about books that he was interested in. He was very interested in the Avengers, very interested in working with George. And I thought, okay, this team is going to work. And then I also got Kurt on Iron Man, because we found we actually loved the Mantlo stuff that Mantlo had done on Iron Man too. And so we kind of bonded on that. And then I was able to get Kurt on Iron Man, and he had a great run on that too. So those were books where I put people together. When I worked on, for example, Daredevil, John Romita Jr. was coming off at the time when I was taking over Daredevil as a full-time editor. I needed an artist and writer, and Frank Miller had left the book at that point, and I needed somebody to come on who wasn't going to be intimidated by what Frank had done. And a lot of people I talked to were intimidated. Said, how can I follow up a Miller run? But I talked to Ann Nesenti. Ann had come to comics because of it. She came to Marvel because she followed an ad in the paper. So she was not a comic book person, really. And she wasn't intimidated. So I thought, I think she's going to work out on this book. And I said, I'll be there with her. And Virginia Romita, who was John Romita Jr.'s mother, she was on staff at that time. She was head of production. And she came to me and she said, John's had a bad experience on one of the books he was working on. And he's kind of depressed right now. She goes, you think you can do something? And I said, you know what? I've got a book that I think would be fabulous for John. So I talked to John and I said, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to put you and Ann together on Daredevil. And I'm sure you know from that run that was a fantastic run. I liked it every bit as much as I did work with Frank. And then after they left, and then Frank, a guy called Frank back because Denny O'Neil had taken the book over. He was on for a while. We had a great run. Daredevil was kind of like our Batman at that time. Denny had such a great time on Batman, great run on Batman with Neil Adams. And I called Frank up, and Denny had been working with David Mazzucchelli, and they worked very well. And when I talked to Frank, he said, do you think David Mazzucchelli would mind the way that I work on a book? And I said, no, I don't think so. Those guys worked fabulously. We did Born Again, kind of a landmark series of Daredevil issues. And then they went off together, and they Batman Year One at DC. And then I was able to put Frank with John Romita Jr. on Daredevil Man Without Fear, and which was originally a screenplay that Frank had done. And he brought that to Marvel and said, let's do this as a series. So it depended on the book. When I took over Thor, Walt Simonson was already on it. Mark Grunwald had put him on. And I just stayed with Walt all the way through. And we eventually got Sal Buscema on it because Walt was getting a little behind on the deadlines, but he wanted to stay on the book. So getting Sal on to do the art worked wonders. And then towards the end, Walt came back on as both writer and as artist. So, again, it depended on the book, but I rarely put a team together that didn't work out. And if there were problems, I was always able, as an editor, to sit down with the guys and work things out, figure out what the problem was. I remember at one point, Sal had asked me, he says, Ralph, do you think you could talk to Walt and give me just a little bit more time? Because Walt was spending a lot of time putting the plots together for the book, and Sal was not having that much time to pencil it. So I talked to Walt, and very accommodating, and he said, sure, Ralph. He goes, I can certainly do that. So we were able to give Sal more time to put more detail into what he was doing. So it worked out on almost every single book that I had the opportunity to be an editor on.
You sort of answered the question I was going to ask next, but I'll go into it a bit. As an editor, you're dealing with young writers, young artists, veteran writers, veteran artists, and you want to encourage them. You want to get the best out of them. But at times you're going to have some rough conversations they don't want to hear sometimes. What was your approach to talking to the talent? How did you try to get the best out of them?
Well, I've always said, and I've mentioned this in interviews with other people too, that to me, the most important job of an editor is to get the best out of the people you're working with, not to be overbearing. To me, the editor is not the comic book that you're editing should not reflect your point of view. It should reflect the point of view of the writer and artist. And I always tried to bring out the very best in the people I was working with, whether it was a writer or an artist. And that meant making them feel important about what they were doing, trying to enthuse them the way I was enthused about the book. I used to say, a lot of times now when you do a book, Fantastic Four, whatever, and you see Galactus. Well, we'd seen Galactus since 1965. So for the writer, it was kind of, we've seen Galactus before, so we bring him back. I said, no, for the reader, you've got to make it seem like this is the first time you've seen Galactus or Doom or the Inhumans or whatever. And I tried my best to work out plots with people and to make them excited about what they were doing. And the same thing with the artist. Try to have them reach another level. when I worked with John Jr. on Daredevil, a lot of people have said that that's the book that he really came out from under his father's shadow and became the John Romita Jr. that was his own man.
Mm.
And when I worked with Bill Sienkiewicz on Moon Knight, that was the book and the character that Bill really became Bill Sienkiewicz. He moved out from the shadow of being a Neil Adams clone. And when it's interesting that when Bill came to Marvel, he had his portfolio with him. And at the time, I was working on a backup in our Color Hulk magazine at the time. The Rampaging Hulk had gone from black and white to color. And we had a Moon Knight backup, and I was working on it with Doug Mensch and Gene Colan. And Gene, one of the top guys of all time, was doing a great job. But I wanted to get more of a Neil Adams Batman feel to it. And Bill came in with his portfolio, and I said, "You're the guy." So I put him on, and right away he and Doug clicked. And then over time, he began to evolve, and he became his own inker. Because at one point I talked to him and I said, "Listen," I said, "you've got a good inker on here." I said, "but I see your pencils." I said, "and you're never going to get, the reader's never going to get the full flavor of your work until you start inking your stuff." So he talked to Denny, and we eventually got him inking his own work. And that worked out beautifully. And then he moved into another phase with his art. He became kind of Ralph Steadman, you know, he moved into that phase and he became someone else. But he was always Bill. There was always the core in there, but he was experimenting with all these different styles. And it really started with Moon Knight. And then I paired him up with Frank Miller on Daredevil. Mm-hmm. And that was supposed to be just a two-part fill-in, but Jim Shooter got a look at what Bill was turning in, and he said, "We can't use this as a fill-in." So that became a Kingpin story in and of itself. It became like graphic novel that they did. But I was always happy to see the talent, to put them together, and then kind of just sit back and watch the chemistry, just see how it worked. And some of those examples I gave you of how I worked with them on, how I worked with different artists and watched them evolve and develop.
On Daredevil, because the book took such a turn. I mean, he was you know, kind of a fun-loving character, sort of a smart guy, smart aleck kind of guy. And then it became a very real story with a lot of stuff going on. I remember speaking to Ann Nocenti. She had that character, I think Rock Gut, who was just,
right.
Oh my gosh, like I don't get spooked easily. Reading that story with who he was there ever any kind of pushback or any kind of, listen, guys, you know, this might be a little too much for, you know, the audience we're going for?
No, on Daredevil, working with Ann, I do have to say that I tried to give Ann her head as much as possible. We had long discussions about every story, and Ann did want to push the envelope. As I say, Ann was not really a comic book person. You know, she answered an ad, but Ann worked out fabulously. She came on as an editor. She edited New Mutants and X-Men and all that, and she just took it like that. She's brilliant. And as a writer, and she's still writing for Marvel, she just wanted to push the boundaries. She wanted to do a story one time about animal rights in Daredevil. And I said, you know what? Maybe we're taking a political position on certain things. I said, but I think it's okay. I said, if we get real pushback, I said, I may have to rein you in a little bit, but I said, let's see what we can do on this. And I did give her the opportunity. And, you know, with some of the characters that she had created on there, Typhoid Mary,
Yes.
you know, John, one of the great, now one of the great Daredevil villains and all, and the things that she did with the Kingpin and all that. Yes, we did push the envelope, and I was always aware that at some point, you know, we could be called on some of these things. But luckily, we were able to pretty much get away with most of what we wanted to do, certainly on Daredevil. Yeah. You know, what you're mentioning too about Daredevil, if you go back to the first issue that Stan did with Bill Everett, that was like a film noir kind of a story. You know, that was like a 50s, 60s gangster kind of a movie. And I always thought Bill Everett was the perfect guy to have done that. I'm sorry that he left after that, because then Stan kind of went through artists. You know, he had a bunch of Joe Orlando, who like the only thing he did for Marvel was an issue with Daredevil. Wally Wood did a few issues, and eventually they settled on John Sr. But he did kind of evolve into this wisecracking, almost Spider-Man type character. But if you go back to that first issue, which is what Frank did when he came on, all the elements of the gangster stuff, the gang war thing, was all there.
Right.
So you could see that if you went back to the real roots of the character, he could go back to being someone, less kind of fun-loving and Spider-Man-ish and more into that film noir mode. That was really set in that first issue.
Is it necessary for a character, I don't want to say to get darker, but to open up, to be more introspective, to look at more real things as opposed to the monster of the week? How am I going to stop this guy? Then at the end, it all works out. I mean, do you think a book needs to walk away from that and start looking at bigger issues in order to have longevity?
Well, I think that really was the Marvel formula,
Right.
was to think about the characters as characters. It was always their private lives that
Mhm.
really intrigued us. Not if you look at Spider-Man, everybody says, okay, you had one of the great villains galleries in all of comics, but at the same time, what kept everybody coming back to Spider-Man was they wanted to find out what was going on in Peter Parker's life. So I think you need to do both. If you really want a successful book, you have to think both about the character's superheroics, the level of villainy, the kind of situations you're going to put him in. But at the same time, you need to see him as the person underneath that mask, whether it's Daredevil or Spider-Man or Captain America or whatever. He needs to have a private life. He needs to have that thing away from the mask. With Captain America was very interesting because I worked on Cap for many years.
Mhm.
Captain America, not an easy character to write or to edit because he was created in 1940, basically, or 1941, whenever Joe Simon and Jack Kirby created him, and basically was kind of an American, propaganda instrument to send over to the troops to get them inspired.
Mhm.
Um, but to make him relevant when he was brought back in the 60s and the 70s, to keep him relevant, Steve Rogers had to be more than that guy in the mask. There had to be a private life for Steve Rogers, and that wasn't easy. I know when I worked with Mark Grunwald for almost 10 years on Captain America, we always had discussions about the kind of women that Steve Rogers would go with. And Steve Englehart, of course, did that brilliant series of books when he was on with Sal Buscema,
Mhm.
where Captain America gave up being Captain America, became nomad, became the man without a country, which again, for that time, was really something quite extraordinary to think about Captain America, the symbol, of America, giving it all up. And we went back and we kind of did something similar. So it really was all about having a character that has a private life, has a real life beyond being a superhero, but also making sure that as a superhero, you gave him the best villains and the best kind of situations you could put him in for combat and struggle.
What I like so much with the Captain Americas you guys worked on is there are a lot of moments where Cap had to find his anger breaking point. Because before, there'd be times in the past where, he'd get frustrated, but then he'd always do the right thing. But you pushed him to points where, his friends, people he cared about, had awful things done to them. And he witnessed it and he, wanted retribution, but he had to rein himself in because of the mantle of Captain America. You can't go kill these guys. You can't walk in with a machine gun and take care of business. You have to control yourself, yet do what you have to do. That stress and that pull on him, was that something that you wanted to bring into the story?
Yes, that was definitely something there because again, we wanted to explore the character.
Mhm.
I can tell you a couple of interesting things about that. Um, there was a cover that we did on one of the Captain America books where we had Captain America holding a gun and he was pointing a gun, and Cap was known, not using guns, etc. Um, and the sales went through the roof because Captain America was doing something he wouldn't ordinarily do, holding a gun. And I remember Mark and I were discussing that, and Mark had this idea. He said, "You know what? We obviously can't turn Cap into something that's like Wolverine." He goes, "But he had an idea for another character that would come in to replace our Captain America,
Mhm.
John Walker, the U.S. agent. The spark for John Walker, the U.S. agent, came from that cover. That's where Mark got the idea for another Captain America who would come in, but he would be the tougher one. He would be the guy that you wouldn't mess with because he would, kill you. He would break your neck. He would do things like that that Steve Rogers would never do. I remember one time having a discussion with one of the writers who came on Captain America somewhat afterwards. And he said, all this stuff about Cap not killing people and all that stuff. He goes, if you go back to the World War II comics that Kirby and Simon did, he was using guns and, he would throw the shield and might cut somebody's head or something like that. He goes, I said, yeah, but that was a different time. I said, that was a war. That was life and death in that situation. So I wasn't sure still whether we ever wanted Steve Rogers to cross that line. But it was interesting that he had brought that out. And I remember looking through those books and all that, and I still think that he restrained himself as Captain America, even back then during World War II. But another story that we did called Streets of Poison. The origin of that story came about when Mark Grunwald and I, we were discussing what makes Captain America Captain America. Is it the super soldier serum and the Vita rays that made Steve Rogers Captain America? Because anybody could do that. Anybody could get that injection. Anybody could have the Vita rays and all that. We realized, we want to show that it's the character of Steve Rogers that makes him different. And, they played that up in the first Captain America movie because there's that great scene where he's trying to join the military. They did that CGI stuff where he's so small and shriveled up and all that. But the captain of his troop throws a grenade out there. Everybody runs away from it, but not Steve Rogers. He falls on the grenade to protect everybody. That shows you that he had the character to be Captain America. It wasn't just the serum. It wasn't just the Vita rays. It wasn't the training. It's the man. And so we played into that. Of course, this was long before the movies were done. But Mark and I talked about doing a storyline where he would lose the super soldier serum, where we would see him without it. How would he do against Crossbones or the Skull if he didn't have that? What would happen? And that's how Streets of Poison came about, where we had the Red Skull going up against the Kingpin in that one too.
Yep.
And Captain America taking on Crossbones when he didn't have the super soldier serum. And we just liked that idea of kind of, dragging him through the mud a little bit, pushing him to the limit and all, but never really crossing that line. We would never do that. We had the U.S. agent to do that.
Yep.
And again, that came, as I said, right from that cover. Captain America pointing a gun at somebody, everybody, the sales went through the roof. And again, Mark had this brilliant idea. He goes, we'll bring in another guy. When Steve Rogers gives up being Cap, this guy comes in, and eventually he became the U.S. agent, but he started off as another Captain America.
Were you surprised that John Walker fans, they saw his actions and they saw how he spoke and he was angry all the time? I mean, it was not a happy person. That I think in the fans' minds, there's no way this man could ever be a long-term Captain America. What are your thoughts on John Walker as a character itself?
Well, I think the character that Mark created, I think was great, and he did have reasons for being who he was, for having that anger. Because if you go back and look at the stories, his parents had been killed.
Yep.
There had been all kinds of things in his background that made him that guy.
Right.
Same thing with Frank Castle. I mean, you see why Frank Castle would become the Punisher, because in certain ways, if something happens to members of your family or whatever, you say, there, but for the grace of God go I, because you don't know what you would do if something like that happened to members of your family. And so I think the foundation was laid for John Walker to be an angry guy. It didn't just come out of nowhere. And I think for him to be that kind of opposite of our Captain America, and again, assume a separate identity as the U.S. agent, where he didn't even have the mantle of Captain America. I think it worked. And I think he had good reasons for being angry all the time, for being that character. Yeah.
I want to ask about a book you mentioned before. It's sort of an offbeat book and one I've always been fascinated with. That's US 1. So basically, it's from I only found out recently it was a toy set, and it was, trucks that go around, and it was, race car trucks. How is this pitched to you, and how do you take this concept and create a book out of it?
Well, I happen to have been working with a very creative guy who was coming on as writer, Al Milgram.
Hmm.
And Al's a guy that were best buddies. Al was, I call him, he's a quadruple threat guy. Al could edit, Al could write, Al could pencil, Al could ink. He could do anything, Al. And he was also one of the nicer guys ever at Marvel. A great, ebullient personality. When I've been to a couple of conventions recently, I've run into Al, and we talked again as if 20 years hadn't gone by that we hadn't seen each other. We were big boxing fans, and we used to talk on the phone all the time about Larry Holmes and Sugar Ray Leonard and all that. That was that period. And he would invite me and some of the other guys out to his house. We'd watch some pay-per-view boxing out there. It was great. But Al was a guy who knew what to do with this property. He had some great ideas for some of the characters like Papa Wheelie and all these other characters that were in there. So when I was given that property, I talked to Al about it, but I have to say, 90% of the creativity and what came about in that book with the Highwayman as his adversary and all, that was Al. That was Al just coming up with this stuff because he was a highly creative guy. And again, he liked playing around with words and things like that. You could tell from his editorials in Marvel fanfare that
Hmm.
he thought along those lines. So it was a book that I loved working on too, and I think we had Frank Springer on for a while, and I think Herb Trimpe did a bunch of issues.
Yep.
But those are books. I'm really sorry that they even ended. I mean, we had a nice conclusion with it, but it was fun all the way. And yes, I wouldn't have known what I would have done with a book like that had that been given to me as a writer. But Al just picked up on that stuff right away, and I said, hey, "Go with it, Al. You got some great ideas. The outer space stuff and all was just it was a blast." Oh, and then getting Michael Golden to do the covers too.
Yes.
That was a lot of fun. People didn't expect that.
Pretty
We
darn
also
good.
got, it was really something. And getting Michael Golden, who I was very friendly with, to
Mhm.
do covers for Chris Starr
Yep.
and some of the other books that I was working, some of the other toy titles, that would sort of catch somebody's eye on the newsstand that wouldn't ordinarily maybe be looking at, say, ROM or Micronauts or US1, and they'd go, "Hey, that's Michael Golden cover." As Tom DeFalco, always said, when you've got a comic book, he goes, the first page is your cover. He goes, and if you don't grab somebody, unless they're a devoted reader,
Hmm.
there's a whole rack of comics like you've got behind you.
Right.
And if you don't grab them in the first few seconds and they go on to something else, you lost them. But if you can grab their attention, get them so that they're intrigued enough by the cover to pick it up and want to flip through it, he goes, you can get another reader in there. So I thought, getting Michael Golden on covers of a book like US1, which, a superhero fan might not pick up ordinarily, I thought would be fun. So it was a great book. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah. Was there ever a book or a project that you worked on that you thought had a ton of potential, but for some reason it just didn't click with readers that you thought really it could have had some legs to it?
Um, I would have to say one of the things that I had worked on were a bunch of characters that I had actually created um, called Black Wolf.
Okay.
And this was at the time that Image had come about, and they were doing things like Youngblood and Cyforce and things like that. So I said, I'm going to come up with a whole bunch of my own characters and tie it into some of the Marvel stuff.
Mhm.
And I got Glenn Herdling as my writer and Angel Medina as the artist. Now, I had created all the characters and kind of set up the scenario, but Glenn ran with it, and he did a fantastic job. And I was hoping that we could have really a long life for that book. When you create characters, these came from me, these characters. I thought, boy, I'd love to get a bunch of years out of this. We got about 11 or 12 issues, and we did manage to conclude the story, almost with the last issue was kind of a cliffhanger. Um, and we'd set those characters up in Thor. Tom DeFalco knew what I was doing, and he was giving me approval to do it as a book. But he says, "You know what, Ralph?" He goes, "We'll kind of set the stage for you in Thor." So we had the Black Bolt characters in there, and I really liked them. And that was something that just didn't catch fire. I was very proud of those characters. I spent a lot of time with Angel Medina designing them and everything.
Mhm.
And Glenn Hurdley came in and did a great job with the writing. I didn't at all guide him in it. I just gave him I said, here, these are what I created. This is kind of the scenario I'm thinking of. Black Wolf kind of being I was looking at Kirby's New Gods, and I was thinking about the the uh, the nature of Orion being both from Apocalypse and from New Genesis. And I thought Black Wolf would be that kind of character too, that had the two sides to him.
Right.
And I was trying to create another dark side type character um, with our villain in there as well. And it just didn't quite catch on. And so that was one that I did work on that I'm sorry really didn't go the distance.
Based on that, when you are creating a character, where does the blueprint begin? Does it begin with a name? Does it begin with an ability, a look? Where do you start and how do you build?
It a lot depends, of course, on the series that you're working on too. Certain characters that we would do maybe in Thor, we wouldn't put in another book. So it's difficult to say where some of these ideas come from. I do remember that in Thor, for example, after we had done all this gigantic stuff, where we had after 300 and 301, where we brought the Asgardians back, who all died, and we had Odin in the destroyer armor going up against the Celestials. And then we had Gaia coming out with the 12 young gods that Jerry Conway had created to show them to Arishem, to say, hey, these guys, this is mankind's potential. So you can give your judgment of Earth now. You don't have to hang around for 50 years with your thumb up here and
Right.
send them away. Mark and I thought, um, we always loved Green Lantern back in the 60s. We were big fans of that. So we kind of created a sort of a Green Lantern type villain. I even forgot the guy's name. He only showed up at one time, but he could sort of create objects mentally and do things. We could see him fighting Green Lantern back in the 60s with
Mhm.
Sinestro and all those type characters. So that's where that came from. Other times, you kind of tailored the villain or the character to the hero. What would work for this guy to go up against this guy? Is there a personal connection? A lot of times that was very important. If you could tie in a personal connection, like the Green Goblin with Peter Parker. Originally the Green Goblin was not known to be Norman Osborn.
Mhm.
He just, when he went up against Spider-Man, there was no connection there between Peter Parker and Norman Osborn. It was just the Green Goblin as a villain, Spider-Man as the hero. Later on, that connection became very strong when there was the connection between Harry Osborn, Peter, and Norman Osborn. That
Mhm.
gave added depth. So if you can do something like that, I think you've got something much richer. Or again, we're creating something like Project Pegasus,
Yep.
where I thought I wanted to do something. I wanted to leave a footprint in the Marvel universe. I wanted to create a place that could be used after I was gone from it, that
Right.
another writer could pick up on and say, "Hey, I want to do something with this."
Mhm.
Um, so it's difficult to say sometimes where the creativity pops up from for a villain or for a hero or for a place even. It really depends on the time. Um, and do you want to get a character personally connected to that hero to go up against him? Or do you just have a fun idea for a villain that you want to throw out there? That's really how it got, at least for me, that's how it
Right.
came.
I just want to ask, I've spoken to Howard Mackie and Terry Cavanaugh and wonderful guys, and
Yeah.
um, they had mentioned something about when you have a book that's popular, which you have had, suddenly the door's knocking all the time. Hey, do you mind if this character guest stars in this book to maybe get a few more eyes on, or this, and this? As a compliment as it is for the wonderful work you guys are doing, and that they see this character as a draw, was there also a sense of frustration like, listen, I've got something going here. I don't know if I really want to pull it from a different direction.
I never really encountered that, or I
Okay.
had the opportunity one time. I can tell you from a reverse point of view.
Okay.
When as you remember, the Kingpin was originally a Spider-Man villain, right?
Yep.
Stan Lee and John Romita Sr.
Hmm.
And John had often said, I remember him mentioning one time that he and Stan got the idea from Sidney Greenstreet. That was their idea for the Kingpin when he was in Maltese Falcon.
Right.
That was, he played the fat man in the Maltese Falcon.
Hmm.
So that's where they got the idea for the Kingpin. But where they changed it was they made him physically powerful. I mean, Sidney Greenstreet, you didn't think he could really do any fighting, but he was very smart and sharp, and when he played the fat man in Gutman was his name in the Maltese Falcon. Um, what happened was uh, Frank had kind of taken Kingpin, if you remember, and moved him
Hmm.
to Daredevil. They did Gang War, and the Kingpin kind of became an overarching presence in a lot of that. And then, of course, when we were doing Born Again, Kingpin was the real enemy in there. And I remember at the time that the editor on Spider-Man at the time wanted to sort of take the Kingpin back. And so there I had a bit of a tussle because the Kingpin has sort of been appropriated now as a Daredevil villain.
Yep.
He hadn't really shown up in Spider-Man anymore. But the editor now was thinking, these guys are doing great stuff with the Kingpin. Imagine if we brought it back to Spider-Man. So there was a bit of a thing going back and forth. Eventually, we did win out.
Hmm.
But when you think about it, the Kingpin originally was a Spider-Man villain.
Exactly.
So that was one instance I can think of. As far as anything else goes, I don't really recall any instance. There may have been something. I remember I was kind of upset at one time where Jeff Lopes, also a good friend, and I worked with Jeff on a number of projects.
Hmm.
But I remember when he had the Red Hulk, when he was doing the Red Hulk,
Hmm.
and he had the Red Hulk kind of rampaging around the Marvel universe, and he was, taking everybody down. And he had a fight with Thor, and he was kind of beating up on Thor, and showed that he could lift the hammer up if he was out in space and all that. And I was really opposed to that. I said, I really don't quite like what you guys are doing with this, but they had the momentum, so they kind of got away with it, on the Hulk book.
Hmm.
And I said, well, someday I'm going to get my opportunity to do that on, and you may see the Red Hulk, taken out in a couple of panels by Thor. So there was always that threat that if you can do it, I can do it.
Right.
I do remember that particular instance, but there were not too many instances um, where you had a character that was being lent out to another office and that character was being mishandled. Really, I would always say I insist on reading the plots if you're going to use this character, and I would say, look, I'm the final word on this because it's really my character. So yeah, but that is an interesting thing, and I know sometimes that frustration could come up if
Hmm.
you're talking to another writer or whatever who had great idea for it and just wants to use the character for an issue or two. So,
There's so much to talk about, but I want to be mindful of your time, and we'd love to have you back. But one question just to wrap up today is, and it's a very loaded question, so forgive me, but someone comes up to you and says, Ralph, what do you do for a living? Is there one project or one story, something that you worked on that you say, you know what, this was me at my best. This was me firing on all cylinders. Everything came together. This project was as I always wanted it.
again, as a writer, I would probably have to say, as a writer, it would
Hmm.
be Thor 300 because so much had been built up at that point to conclude this gigantic cosmic epic that would have ramifications really throughout the Marvel universe because we
Hmm.
were taking Kirby's idea that Arishem sit in judgment of mankind for 50 years. And I remember when I talked to Mark about that, we were saying, at this point, even though the Eternals had been discontinued at that point, you still have Arishem down in the Andes with his thumb up, going, I'm waiting to see what you guys do. And I said, that kind of puts everything else in the shade because it doesn't matter how many times Spider-Man takes down the Green Goblin or the Lizard or whatever, there's still Arishem up there. No matter how many times Iron Man takes out the Titanium Man. I said, we want to eliminate that threat. So let's do something. And that was a big deal. And to do what we did in issue 300 and to conclude the Ring of the Nibelung saga which
Mhm.
had been running for a number of issues in there that Roy had done. I would say probably as a writer, I'm most proud of that. Although there were many things that I did that I was very, very proud of.
Right.
As an editor, it's so tough to say. Because I was such a big Stephen King fan, I so loved working on the Dark Tower, where we didn't adapt. By the way, at Stephen King's insistence, we did not adapt the Dark Tower books.
Okay.
We took Roland Deschain as a young man, and we showed other adventures with him, how he became the gunslinger,
Mhm.
and also doing the stand also. But I guess as an editor, because it's gotten so much press and publicity and become such a landmark thing, I would have to say maybe Born Again, because I kind of, asked Frank to come back out of the blue.
Yeah.
Nobody expected this. And he and David did what really became a quintessential Daredevil story. They almost kind of set the trend for so many years afterwards. And now we're coming up to the 40th anniversary
Yeah.
of that next year, 1986 to 2026.
Mhm.
So I guess I would have to. If somebody put a gun to my head, I would probably say that. But after we're done with this, I'll go. Oh, wait a minute. No, I'm thinking of this right now because Born Again is on my head when I go to conventions. So many people ask me to sign copies of it and
Mhm.
everything, and it's coming up to the 40th anniversary. So I'll give you that one.
That works for me. And we're back. Oh, what a nice guy. Like I said, we had to have him back because it was literally the tip of the iceberg for all the things that he's done in this industry. But I didn't know, about Crystal Warriors, that they were something that they created in hopes of getting a toy line, sort of a reverse thing that Marvel's been doing. So that was really fascinating. And Rom, talking about Mr. Bill Mantlo, his Ralph's memories of him. What a wonderful guy. And so we're so glad that we're able to cover that and hopefully cover so many more things in upcoming episodes with Ralph. So, guys, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you again next week.